Shall we make a start?
Let's do
Because there's
it.
quite a bit to get through. So,
Okay.
good afternoon and welcome to the latest episode of the Work-Life Webinars series. Today, we're talking all about online collaboration, and I'm delighted to be joined by my co-host on the podcast, My Pocket Psych, Pilar Ortiz. Hi, Pilar. How are you doing?
I am very well. Hey, this is just like an episode.
I
I'm
know.
doing well.
With video, so we're not used to that.
And people watching.
Hello, yes. So, all about online collaboration. And before we dive into the content, just a couple of things to cover off. First of all, this is being recorded, so people can revisit it, just to make everyone aware that it's being recorded. And secondly, we're going to save that recording on the YouTube channel. So feel free to share that with anyone who couldn't make it today, or indeed revisit it yourself. So a little bit about me. If you haven't joined one of our sessions before, I'm the managing director of Work-Life Psych. My day job is as a psychologist in the workplace, and I spend a good chunk of my time coaching individuals and working with teams, working across three broad themes of productivity, well-being, and effectiveness. And definitely those productivity and effectiveness themes come together when we look at collaboration online. I mentioned the My Pocket Psych podcast, and we'll be signposting, I should say, a specific episode of that where Pilar and I have discussed this a little bit previously, and we think that'll be interesting for you. If you want to find out anything else about me, just go to worklifepsych.com. Pilar.
Yes, co-host also of My Pocket Psych with Richard, and I specialized in helping teams transition to remote in normal times. So this has been an interesting time, but mainly I'm the director of Virtual Not Distant. So yeah, that's that. I think that's it. They can find out more about me as we continue speaking.
Okay, and as we go through, please drop questions into the Q&A or raise your hand. We like these to be as interactive as possible. What do we do at Work-Life Psych? We're a team. We work globally, and we work in the development space. So we help individuals, teams, and organizations, anything to do with people development. And interestingly enough, and you won't be surprised to learn, the last 6 to 7 months, our focus has overwhelmingly been on employee well-being, dealing with all of the upheaval and the disruption and upsets that has come with the COVID-19 pandemic. But at the same time, a big chunk of the work has been around helping people work in new ways, based on people working from home a lot more, distributed, not being co-located. And so we think this is a theme that's really relevant to lots of people.
And well, similarly with Virtual Not Distant, I would say we do a transition to what do we still call office optional, and we're hoping that the option to go back to the office will continue to increase. And we talk about something called visible teamwork, which is really what we've been saying distributed companies do. So companies that were born distributed and remote, and under the umbrella of visible teamwork, it's a series of concepts, and they're mainly about communicating asynchronously, which is why I'm joining Richard here today. And a new service that we've developed, if it's of any use, it's another asynchronous way of communicating, which is in-house podcasting. Is what we've been thinking is that podcasting is a great tool for community building and something that could be exploited by organizations. So grabbing different voices from the organization to create that sense of belonging through a portable, non-video focused medium.
Super. As I said at the outset, this is part of a series that we call Work-Life Webinars. They're all free. They're all about 45 minutes long, and they're going to be running right through till the end of the year. You can find out all about them at worklifepsych.com/webinars. The next few are all about the well-being side of things. We've got one around imposter syndrome and those kind of thoughts that can drag us down and impact our self-confidence. A session on dealing with overwhelm, whether that be workload or change. And then a session on work-life harmony, managing those boundaries that are being blurred more and more all the time. So
Nice word, harmony.
yeah, well, it's, normally that's talked about as being work-life hassle, work-life conflict, or work-life balance. And as probably anyone who knows me knows, I can't stand those phrases. So we're trying to look at it from a slightly different perspective. So today we're going to just underline why it's important to consider this topic right now. We're going to cover what we see as the basics of asynchronous work, and then talk about the principles that organizations need to consider at team and wider levels about introducing these kinds of arrangements. Mindful, of course, that lots of people have had these kinds of arrangements imposed on them this year in a less than planned way, but we've always got opportunities to improve things. We'll highlight some common pitfalls to try and avoid, and then we'll signpost you in the direction of some additional resources and get you thinking about what you could do next for you and your organization. But as we go through this, bearing in mind, these sessions always have a very diverse audience, and both geographically and job diversity and so on, we'd like you to think about what kinds of changes you've been going through over the last 6 months and how those changes have impacted how you communicate and work with your team. What looks differently and what worked, and maybe where have been the points of challenge for you and your colleagues. With those real examples in mind, we hope to bring this stuff to life for you so it can be a lot more practical, and it may spark some questions on your part. So do, as I said, drop them into the Q&A or the chat, raise your hand. I'll keep my eyes on that and I hopefully answer that in a timely manner. So why are we looking at this topic now? I mean, we're all aware there's been a huge amount of disruption to workplaces, not always offices. We need to be mindful of that. All kinds of workplaces have been disrupted over the last 6 to 7 months. And we've got lots of people who have had to work at home, many of whom have been doing that for the first time, many of whom have been doing it under less than optimal circumstances. And this kind of working at home arrangement is likely to continue for many people, but not all. And so we're likely to have teams, organizations that are split between people working in a co-located, same location arrangement and colleagues who are based at home, and maybe not even on a permanent basis. So lots of rolling changes as we go forward. So with this in mind, we're proposing that we really need sustainable solutions to this. Many people spent the first few months of lockdown in a kind of a sprint mentality. If I get the head down and I work really, really fast, maybe this disruption will seem like it's going by more quickly. This disruption is here to stay in one form or another for at least another year or two. So we need to work sustainably and do this in a planned and intentional way. So when we do this, even in a very planned way, we can face challenges. And of course, many people have realized these challenges as unintended consequences of working at home or in a more distributed way. One of the ones that we hear a lot about is people being tired of experiencing back-to-back Zoom meetings. Incidentally, we hope this isn't one of those for you today. Even though it's in Zoom, we hope you've had a break between your last conversation and this. And so we need to think about the different context that work is happening in at the moment. And because the context has changed, we need to adjust and not pretend that things are going to either snap back to the way they were, or that we can continue to work in the way that we have been and hope that it will somehow work for us. So that's kind of setting the scene and the rationale for this topic today. So I'll hand over to Pilar at this point to talk a little bit about the basics of asynchronous work. Maybe you never heard of this phrase before today. So we're going to start at first principles. Pilar, hand over to you.
Yes, thank you. So just going on from what you were saying as well, that the way in which many people have started to work online, to work remotely, has been through meetings, because they are the form of communication that is most similar to what we were used to in the workplace. It's real-time communication, a bit like what Richard and I are doing now. Of course, we're not getting any immediate feedback from people listening, but that's kind of the conversation. It's a real-time interaction. And what asynchronous work or asynchronous communication allows us to do is to not have to share time. So it's that thing that now we know that we can work together without sharing space, thanks to technology. We also don't have to share the time. So what we mean by that is communication that I post my message or send my drawing or however I'm communicating, and the person receiving it goes to that communication when they're ready to consume it and then replies in their own time. It's not that simple, but because there's lots of agreements on the way. But it's really about what can we be communicating about our work, about ourselves, about our context to other people in our team without having to do it in real time. And of course, technology now, I mean, we're not going to go into any depth at all about technology because that's another huge conversation today. But technology has allowed us to do that. And sometimes it's a question of finding the right technology for the right kind of communication. So asynchronous is basically in time independent. One example of this is how Richard and I work on the podcast on My Pocket Psych. So we have, and we'll name a tool, it is my favorite. We have a Trello board where Richard, as he decides and designs what the content can be for the next episode, he posts a card, and then we have all the conversations about that episode within that space. So he will maybe put some description, he'll maybe ask a question, he will talk to the sound engineer, Ross, in that card. Now, I don't need to be involved in that conversation, but for me, it's really interesting at some point to look in and see what they've been talking about, because it might give me some information that they might not even know I'm interested in. So it's time independent, so we can do that whenever we want. And funnily enough, apart from the conversations that we've had in real time to prepare this webinar, of which we've had 2 short ones, Richard and I will only speak in real time when we're doing the show, when we're doing the podcast, but all the other stuff, all the other work, sharing of resources, everything is posted somewhere else. Of course, we're not full-time doing the podcast, so different kinds of arrangements will require different balances of synchronous and asynchronous. So one of the reasons why we've decided that this could be a good topic was because it's an alternative to meetings. So we can look at meetings sometimes can be exhausting, even though they can be the main and fastest way of communicating. But what we found is that they can be a bit exhausting. So we can switch. Richard is doing the slides today. Richard, can you switch slides? So we find that what happens in meetings is that we find silence a bit more. The silence in the online space feels longer. So maybe we don't have as much time to think as when we're doing a real-time conversation in person. The delays in the connection can start to make us feel icky. We might hear that word a bit today, icky. The delays in the connection can affect the conversation. It can affect our relationships even. And if we've decided to have conversations with the camera on, they might feel that pressure that we're there. That we're there on stage all the time. So this is some of the things I picked up from an article on the BBC, which was looking at why video conferencing can be so exhausting. So the alternative is to have other types of spaces, like we're saying, and we're thinking of how can we make some of our conversations visible? How can we make some of our thinking visible? And this is done through asynchronous spaces. The technology is there. It can be Google Docs, it can be Trello boards, etc. And we want to start thinking about what is the balance that our team needs. So obviously, if our team is working very closely together and the cadence of communication needs to be quite high, if we really rely on each other being available all the time for our work, then the balance of asynchronous will be small. We'll have not as much asynchronous communication. However, if our work means that we want to be spending a lot of time concentrating on a piece of work, if we're quite independent from each other as regarding the work, the tasks, and we use each other mainly for support, or where one piece of work finishes, another one ends, then we can see that it's not as important to have real-time conversations, and we can start designing our spaces so that we can have more paced conversations, which can be done in the asynchronous space. So I think that is, I mean, I don't know if anyone has any questions, and of course we're not going into any detail, which is really difficult because everyone's context is different. But I think those are the basics. Did I forget anything, Richard?
I would just want to go back to something you mentioned about how we pull the podcast together, in that you can dip in and out of the conversations, those written conversations I have with Ross. But if we didn't have that approach, that would be emails, and you would be copied in on loads of emails, or you wouldn't see them at all.
Yeah.
And it would be direct between Ross and I. So there's another element here, which is public versus private communication that we will come back to, but it's a very different way of doing it, and there's a very big optional element to dip in and out of that, and it's there for you if you want to go to it, rather than an inbox full of messages that you've somehow been copied in on.
And yeah, as you've picked up on that, another interesting point. And of course, some people have preferences. I have a very strong preference for not using email with collaborators, because I like to have a space I go to. My inbox collects everything. It collects collaborators, it collects clients, all sorts of stuff. But my Trello board that I use for my Pocket Psych only has that conversation. My Slack space in Virtual Not Distant only has conversations with my team. If I'm working with a client, it might be a team in Teams, and that's my space that I go to. So that independence of time and space, and creating a dedicated space online also means I know where my collaborators are, and I know where to go and find them when I'm ready for that.
And of course, this is very different to being co-located in an office space where it might just be as simple as looking over your monitor to ask someone a question or overhearing something. And it's one of the fears that we hear a lot from organizations about giving people this flexibility to work in different places. What will happen to those conversations that just happen by the coffee machine and that kind of thing? And that's something that we're going to return to, but it's not as rigid as many people think, and as inflexible as sometimes we think.
Yeah.
So what I'd like to do now is talk about some of the principles, some of the things to bear in mind if we were introducing these kinds of arrangements into the workplace. Again, there's no rules for this. They need to be interpreted locally, considering the context of the organization. But there are some broad brush things to pay attention to if you're introducing these arrangements or looking to improve the arrangements that are in place as a result of a lockdown or something similar. So the first is to turn to context and be really clear on the context of your organization. It's something that's very, very important to look at. What do people do here? What do their roles look like? What does the interdependence between roles and teams look like? And what kind of outputs are we creating? And just to go back to what Pilar said, that could be the difference between people spending a lot of time live discussing in meetings versus a minimal amount of time in the same time and a maximal amount of time working in isolation with that interdependence that might be sequential. When I've done my bit, then you pick it up, and then you pick it up, and so on. But there is no one model of this. And so you need to look at what needs to be done rather than what has always been done. Maybe the perception is that we need lots of time together because we've had lots of time together. A fresh look at context, a fresh look at what you're seeking to create or provide could give you another perspective on that. We also really want to underline the second point, looking at your culture before you look at tools, and culture in the broadest possible sense. The big trap to avoid here is to pick a tool or tools and then somehow force those into your organization. Think about, how do we do things here? What is it we want to express in our culture? What is it we want to emphasize? And then look at, because there are so many tools, look at what the different tools have to offer. Otherwise, it's the cart before the horse. Also, to acknowledge that there will be adjustments need to be made in the everyday work. Everything from when someone is available, when they have access to information. It could be very small things, but this isn't like one change. And I think, Pilar, you'd agree, this is like a series of small adjustments that happen throughout the organization once this kind of thing is introduced. It's not a discrete flick of a switch. It's more a series of adjustments, and it can percolate and permeate through the organization in surprising ways. And as a result, the next point underlines that we need to acknowledge how that might change the culture of the organization and how it should change how we view skills. By that specifically, I mean that if you want to work asynchronously and people are not going to be co-located and have those ad hoc chats by the water cooler, then other skills will need to be trained and emphasized, developed and encouraged. Specifically communication skills, but also technical skills, how to use these apps to best effect. Now that needs to permeate into talent management to see that these skills are valued at all levels in the organization, that as people are hired and onboarded, that these skills are emphasized, and we don't leave people to sort of figure it out as they go along. If this is how the organization is going to work, even in part, it needs to be explicitly included in whatever you have, be it a competency framework, a skill set, a learning and development offering. This is going to be part of how you do things from now on. Again, this represents a change. And for some people, that could be a disruptive change. For some, it could be quite exciting. But the ethos here is one of guiding and reinforcing good behavior rather than punishing people for getting it wrong. Depending on how long you've been in the workforce, you might have to unlearn some really long-standing habits. And that's tough from anyone who's ever tried to change their behavior. So a supportive ethos that really reinforces the good stuff that we see is going to be much more productive. And finally, there's a point here about understanding and communication. The temptation could be for senior stakeholders to manage all of this, to say, we're picking a system to use, we're putting new rules together, we're going to announce this is how it's going to be, we're going to give flexibility to certain people. Now, of course, some people are going to have to sign off on arrangements. Some people are going to have to agree a budget or agree boundaries to this. But many, many, many other people further down the pecking order need to share how their jobs work and what they need from a system. If they're not going to be co-located all the time or even any of the time, we need to have that bottom-up reflection, bottom-up feedback so that the top-down decision makers are fully appraised of how things work. Because I think, as we all know, there's a big difference between a job description and what someone actually does, between what's on the posters and what we actually see day to day. So we need to be as inclusive as possible when considering what decisions are made around this. Pilar, anything to throw into the mix there?
I would just like to reinforce that it is a change program. This is something that, many companies, as technology has been introduced gradually, even before we needed to work away from each other. It takes time. It is a change program because we're changing some of the ways in which we're communicating. It could be a culture change, or it could be just, like you're saying, a culture reinforcement. We need to understand what is it that we want to continue promoting and what is it that we might want to change through this. And also, going back to your point about considering culture before tools, being very aware, and sometimes we don't have much of a choice of what we're going to end up using, being aware how starting to use certain tools might change the way in which we communicate and might change how we behave, and just being aware of that so that we're not being led by how the tool works. Because that's something that could happen if you've started using any kind of new technology. You might see that. So I think it is underestimated. Introducing something like asynchronous communication, where we need to delay that communication, basically you delay by delaying the time, or that you might start to segment the communication a bit more. Instead of everything being discussed in one place, you start to discuss tasks in a certain place, you start to have longer discussions in a certain place, chit chat in a certain place, rather than what we're used to, which is face-to-face real time in the same space. So I think that cannot be underestimated.
And just to elaborate on my final point there, that if we view this as a change process, then we need to involve the right people in it, not just in terms of seniority, but I would strongly argue that this isn't a process that sits only with IT, only with HR, only with L&D. It needs to involve as many people with their expertise as possible. So it's a nice, rounded and inclusive process.
Yeah.
Tell us, Pilar, about this asynchronous communication. What is it that we need to be able to do if we're going to do it well?
Yeah, they really are the building blocks, and it's regarding what technology we end up using and how we end up using it. There are just some very simple things that we might need to revisit. I think that a lot of the time what I'm seeing is that companies that have been using technology, something I will name, something like Google Suite or Office 365, they have been using it already in the co-located space, But now that we're depending on it so much more when we are completely distributed from each other or in a hybrid space, we need to use it differently. So for example, maybe notifications weren't a problem before because the volume of notifications, of pings that were being created wasn't that great, but now maybe it is. Or maybe we didn't used to need notifications because it was okay. Every now and then we looked at these tools, see we had a comment or something, but now we have lots more and we're missing out on it because we don't have a way of knowing if someone needs us through it. So I think that notifications, it's really important to know how to turn them on, off, when, etc. And if you just go to any help section of any program, that is quite an easy thing to find. What starts to be more complicated, although it's quite simple once you get to, is agreeing reply times. So how long should we wait between someone posting a message and then having to reply, especially if it's a group message? Because I think we can all agree that usually when I'm talking to, if I send a message to Richard knows that that message is only to him. And so he probably wants to reply relatively quickly, at least to say that he's received it. Depends, because no one else is there to do that. But if I post a message for a team for 10 other people, what does the silence mean? Does that mean that people have seen it and they don't know what, and they don't have anything to say? Or does it mean that no one wants to reply or no one has seen it? So that is important. And this does feel, go back to that wonderful word, icky, because we're not used to having to define how we talk to each other, because we already know that. So in a new team, we can see how this is something that we go, yeah, we need to do this. But in teams that actually have become a new kind of team by transitioning, this might feel strange. And even I'd go as far as emoji meaning. Now this we're getting into when we're using a lot of chat-based, text-based communication and we have emojis. What does that mean? What does the thumbs up mean? Does it mean I agree or that I've seen it? Mm-hmm. Does the tick mean I've seen it or that I approve? So it's worth doing that. And along that, the checking in, the wonderful thing about these spaces is that you have the space and you can go and see the conversation. If no one has pinged you and there's nothing there waiting for you, but you can see. But how often should we be checking in? Do I need to be looking at this every day or once a week? What is it? How do I check in with my team? And also if you need to acknowledge that you've seen something but not need to interact. Different communication channels, you can already see, yeah, of course, we need to know what kind of conversation goes where. And that just takes me back. The last point here is what I'm saying is that it can feel very strange to say we've got to communicate like this, especially, and this goes a little bit back to Richard's point about learning how to use each platform, especially because a lot of us will have been using something. We will have maybe, even if we've been in a Facebook group or if we've been in a community Slack or something. And there we don't have agreements because it's ad hoc. It's for people to go in when they want. But we're talking now about communication that is not about when we have the time to do it, but it becomes really core to how we operate. So we need some sort of agreement. It can be very simple, but it's worth agreeing, reviewing, and changing if it's not working out. So bearing that in mind, these are the building blocks. Then there's some other things that we might want to consider. And that is, Richard was already talking about open conversation versus private conversations. And the example here is, and this is why apps like Slack were born. If I have an email, I send an email to Richard and he receives it and we have that conversation. But it could be that unbeknownst to me, Ross, our engineer, is also interested in that question. Maybe it doesn't affect him directly, but actually he's been thinking about it. If I post it in an online space, in an asynchronous space, there is that possibility that someone else might see it. It's the same, the equivalent as overhearing a conversation in an office. It's that same thing. Is, hey, Richard, have you got those numbers? And then someone else says, oh, I've got them. Don't worry, Richard. So it's that, and that is one of the things that some teams have struggled with. There's all sorts of reasons always for this. For some people, it's very easy to just put anything in public in their team. So sharing anything in an open space is easy. We might be used to it. We might really not care about saying something that sounds silly. However, some people might. It might come from other experiences they've had at work where actually you don't want to be seen making a mistake. And any opportunity, any instance when you are posting in the open is an opportunity to make a mistake or say something that lands badly. So there is that to consider. What is the balance and what conversations benefit from being in the open? But of course, always respecting the private. This does not mean that we do all our conversation in the open. What starts to happen also is that as we start to experiment also with this kind of communication, it doesn't become only about we're doing everything in one way or the other. Some conversations we have asynchronously, we don't need to take them anymore to the meetings, and the meeting time becomes more valuable. It means that those conversations that are really difficult to have in writing are taken to meetings, but those conversations that are really quite simple to work around can be done in an asynchronous way. So we start to see how both spaces support each other. And we have also a place for asynchronous discussion before a meeting. We have the meeting. Remember that not everyone is at their best at the same time or in a group. So then we have a follow-up period of asynchronous during which we can continue some of the conversation. So many ways of doing it. And then from a very practical point of view, of course, especially for the smaller companies that might be using different kinds of tools, and there's lots of free stuff, it is just to be aware of what the security is of the apps we're using, what tech is available to us, because in some companies you will have one set and that's it. So you've got to manage that. But if you're starting to pick your tools, what are the security levels? As an anecdote, Richard, Trello, as I mentioned, is used in all sorts of ways. It's used to visualize the workflow like we do, but it's also used to have recruiting processes on it, some company directories. And something they found not long ago was that a lot of boards were open. So they had like HR boards that were open, just stuff that you really didn't want to be in the public domain because, which takes us to the last point, because we hadn't really looked at how to use the app. So we'd set this up and we hadn't seen that actually I need to click on private or else it is public. So that is something to bear in mind. And then the point that I think is, I don't know, Richard, we often talk about the curse of the mobile. We never talk about it like that, but I've just said it. It's the curse of the mobile.
Oh, I did.
You're excellent. And what I've seen is because with asynchronous communication, you can overload yourself. You can never stop working. Because if I'm having a conversation with you, at some point we stop, but asynchronous, it can go on forever. But what I've seen is that the problem is not as much the computers as the mobile, because the mobile just means it's really easy to access communication. And to be honest, that is a challenge for me. I am I'm a collaborator. All my collaboration is done online. So Trello is my place to talk to my friends. Basecamp is my friend. Slack is my friend. And they're all on my phone. So because I love what I do so much, I have become quite addicted to seeing what's going on. So also that option, having these communication apps on our mobile is great because we can just look at them and do whatever, but also it means they're so easily accessible that we just have to be a little bit careful. So that's some of the considerations. I don't know, Richard, if you want to take us through more pitfalls to avoid, and if anyone has anything to add, please do in the chat. It's always very interesting to hear what other people have to say.
And of course, none of our lists are finite. These are just big ticket items. I would compare this final point here to email and the scourge of email, that email is just given to people. Very, very infrequently are people trained in using email the way it was designed to be used. The same could happen to any of these asynchronous communication tools. And so we need to ensure that people both use them properly and use them to their best effect so that the tool doesn't represent a form of friction as part of this change process, and people don't get inordinately frustrated with the tool because they can't figure out how to do things. If we train them how to use it up front, then that's a lot less likely to happen. So there are numerous pitfalls. I've pulled together a list that we really want to get in front of you today, and do shout out if there's any of these that you either identify with or you'd like to discuss in more detail. I mean, number one, we've seen it a lot this year, even though people are working in a kind of an asynchronous format, and they're definitely working in different physical spaces. The effort has been to try and replicate the physical workplace by having everyone online at the same time. Lots of meetings, lots of meetings, lots of meetings, without the capacity to allow people to work on their own thing at a period of time and reconnect occasionally. And that takes its toll on a number of levels, on efficiency, productivity, but also well-being. It's exhausting to be in back-to-back meetings on video, more so than being in the same room. So we need to think about what needs to be done rather than how do we make it feel like we're still in the office. We can also, and this applies to every change process I've ever been involved in, we can also see the impact of poor leadership role modeling. If we as a team agree that we're going to use different communication media for different channels for different purposes, we might do that. And then, the urgent message is on Slack. The conversation reflection might be on a discussion forum. But if I, as a senior stakeholder, can't be bothered to learn how to use those, and I'm emailing everyone all the time, and then I'm getting angry that people aren't looking at my emails quick enough, then any of the change we've tried to instill will quickly unravel, because we look to senior people and they reinforce the behaviors they want to see in us. And as Pilar has intimated with one very good example, we can have unintended behavioral consequences. We need to be really clear with people about uptime, on-time, connected time, so that because this is there's a couple of Google engineers have referred to these and other systems like them as infinity pools. You never get to the bottom of them. And so you could spend every waking hour looking at this content. So we need to remind people about the boundaries between the work and the non-work, reasonable expectations, and to ensure that we don't lead people to feel like they're being monitored, and that these communication channels are used appropriately. And so it's not just about implementation, it's about implementation, evaluation, updates, and continual reviewing as things change. We also don't want to make it too complex. This isn't about introducing 6 different systems at the same time. We just want to see what's necessary to keep things going. And we're not going to replace face-to-face contact either. We don't want to give people the excuse or the inference that they should be somehow hiding behind a screen rather than having important conversations. So reflection can be done on a chat forum. Quick questions can be done via Slack, but performance reviews or development conversations, they should be done face-to-face. And that's just a simple example. So it's not all or nothing. It's what are we trying to do here? And that will allow us to decide the tool, the medium, the channel. We also don't want to have that fixation with tools. It's a crowded space. There's a lot of them out there. We want to really not design our work around the tools, but be clear on our work and then find the tools that allow us to do good work. I've mentioned it already, but we really need to give people training. And this is not just about the tool. It's about communication. It's about dealing with working by themselves. It's about effective productivity, prioritization, self-management. When we're not in the office, we miss a lot of the visual cues, and we don't realize how much we're under the influence of other people's behavior. Put us alone in a room for days at a time, and we can slip out of some very good habits into some bad habits or unhelpful habits. So we do need to give people training and guidance in an ongoing way about how to work like this. It can be, and as we've seen in lots of environments this year, can be tempting for managers to start to micromanage or want to monitor what people are doing when they're not co-located. And it's very interesting how the discussion about employee monitoring has really increased in volume this year, kind of insidiously. And so we don't want to put these tools out there to collect keystrokes and see the uptime for individuals. This is about getting the work done. Does the location or does the timing of that work within reason matter? And for most workplaces, it doesn't, as long as it's being done to deadline, to an appropriate quality. And this is where management training is really, really important. And we want to avoid leaving people behind unintentionally. This might be around technology, confidence. This might be because some people are co-located and some people aren't, and some of those conversations are happening and are not being shared. It might be around confidence in communication that isn't face-to-face. So we do need ongoing reviews of how well this is working, and encouragement and coaching of those people who are finding it more difficult than others. As I said, it's not a finite list. Pilar, do you have anything else to throw into this?
I did it. Did it have to do with tools? No. I think the point about the temptation to micromanage is really important. Also has that other flip side that if we are leading the team, or if we are one of those team members that is heavily involved, we can want to know everything that's going on. And also the leader doesn't have to be involved in everything, in every discussion. And that is really difficult. Even when we have the best of intentions and our intention is not to micromanage, we have all the information available all of a sudden, even the information we wouldn't have had in the office, because it's the conversation we wouldn't have been there to hear. So I think that takes discipline. It takes, actually, I know now what I wanted to say, that when you were talking about overcomplicating the processes and the fixation with tools, this is a great opportunity to break down how we work together and how we want to communicate. So the transition to starting to use this way of communication makes us stop and have a really good look at how we're working, what our relationship to each other is, what our relationship to the tasks is, what kind of communication is important, and what kind of communication do we not want to lose when we're apart from each other. So it's a really, it's even if we end up just going back to whatever we were doing, if we stop and think how we would use this kind of communication, I think it's also an interesting exercise.
And we can avoid several of these by sticking to those building blocks and principles we mentioned earlier about clarity of communication, clarity of expectations, mutual expectations, clarity of response times, clarity of channels. Well, if that is all encoded and communicated and agreed, then we're much less likely, it won't be impossible, but we're less likely to see some of these rearing their heads later on.
Yeah. Should we pick up on leaving some employees behind? Yeah,
absolutely. This is a really key point. Pilar, over to you.
It is. And to be honest, watchers, viewers, listeners, live or recorded, this is one of my my ethical dilemmas, because I really champion this form of communication. I love writing. I am a very fast typist. I love reading. I read very fast. I have no problems. I have interviewed in the other podcast for 21st Century Work Life some champions of asynchronous, and you do hear a lot that remote workers have to be good writers. Well, maybe, but that does mean what happens with people who are who just don't use writing as their first medium of expression and have never had or don't want to they just don't do it. So I think we need to start looking at, we need to be almost ahead of what we're being offered in technology, and it's asynchronous doesn't always have to mean text-based and written. It mostly does because of what we've got available, but our phones, where they come in handy, is that it can be quite easy to record a file and then post it somewhere that everyone can then listen to at some point. I don't have anything written at the moment, but it could be that I had a really important list that I wanted to share with you. It's also written, but it's not typed. It might be more of a note. I might have sketches. I might be someone who just thrives on sketching out ideas and making really sketches that really help me clarify an idea. Share those, take a picture of that. However, it doesn't have to look sophisticated. It can be messy. That is absolutely fine. So there's a lot of stuff that needs to be shared. Again, we've already covered that you don't need to be on top of everything. And also what starts to happen, those people that have a lot of affinity for technology might be very engaged with the tech. So for example, if we're making our workflow visible, and this involves us checking a list, for example, or saying what we've done each day, and we forget to do that, that can affect relationships. And it's not that we're not doing the work, it's that we're forgetting to report to the team about the work, and that can cause friction. So again, that difference in affinity with our relationship with tech, we have to be also careful with that. And then the point that Richard was already starting to make about if we have a hybrid workspace, if we're starting to work from the office and online, if we introduce asynchronous, that is an online space, which means there might be conversations in the physical space that get lost because you're not capturing them. We don't have to capture everything, but there can also be more importance being given to the people who are doing all their communication online, because suddenly more of their thoughts are visible than the ones that are more ephemeral and more real time. So it's again understanding, and almost, especially if you're working in a real-time physical space with other people, you almost start to develop a second sense. If I have a conversation in the corridor with Richard, and then it's, who could have benefited from overhearing this that is not in the office? And then finding a way of reporting that. It can be a phone call. We're just talking about this, we thought of you. It can be a message async, that's fine. But it's who else should have been part of this conversation if we were sharing time and space. So I think there's a lot around this. This is huge, and I would love any comments from any. I mean, I know we're overrunning, of course. I talk so much, but any comments around this for the podcast would be great. Really, really important.
I think it's a key one in that a lot of the exclusion could be unintentional. You know, we're not talking about people gaming the system or you know, being unhelpful colleagues. It can happen. So it's something to watch out for. One of the things we'd like you to think about is the questions as they occur to you. Possibly now, that would be great. But if they don't, send them to us so that we can answer them on the podcast, because we're going to be coming back to this topic again and again over the next few months. But think about how you would want to do this in your environment. What needs more attention? What your organization, your team could be doing really well in this space. It's not all doom and gloom. We're recommending you have a listen to episode 66 of our podcast, My Pocket Psych, where we go into this in a little bit more detail. And of course, you'll be able to revisit the recording of this on YouTube, and you can find that at worklifepsych.com/YouTube. Recordings have been made of all of these webinar series, so they're all available to you. And if you do want to ask a question on the back of this, send it to us on Twitter at MyPocketPsych, and that way we'll know it's for inclusion in the podcast. And then you'll have to listen to the podcast to get the answer. See, there's some deviousness to this. Also, Pilar, you're going to be running a webinar on visible teamwork soon. That was
Yes, it is. I was just looking up the date. It is on the 27th of October, 10:30 BST, but you can find all the information there at virtualnondistant.com/events.
And all of the other webinars are listed via that link there. We have gone over, we often do, because these things do take on a life of their own, but we don't have to dash anywhere. So if anyone has any questions, by all means, either drop them into the Q&A or put up your hand. We can unmute, we can have a conversation, or you may want, after that download of information, to give it a good think and reflect before coming back to us. It's up to you. I'm not seeing anything appear in the Q&A, but I always wonder, is someone typing? Oh, here we go. Sorry. In the chat. A thank you. Well, that's lovely as well. It's not a question, it's a thank you. That's always nice to hear. Lisa, you're very welcome. I hope you found it useful. We wanted to create something that was food for thought today, rather than answers to all of the questions. We hope it's given you that food for thought, and we look forward to hearing from you with questions and seeing you at future events. But for now, thanks everyone for joining us.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.